Hello everyone and welcome back to CRTV 131 Contemporary American Cinema. This is class number 2 and today we are going to look at some of the influences on contemporary cinema. And we're going to start off with the 3 stages of the genre film, and we're going to look at the bloated era, and we're going to take a brief look at some foreign film directors from the 1950s and 1960s that are all going to be such a huge influence on the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s filmmakers. So let's get started. First off, the 3 stages of the genre film. And the first stage of the genre film is classic. Now, classic doesn't have to mean old. I picked horror for our genre, and we're going to look at 3 stages of horror, but there are lots of classic horror films, classic westerns, classic musicals being made today. So just because I picked a movie from the 1930s doesn't mean classic means old. If we were to look at war movies, Saving Private Ryan is a real classic war movie, and that's from the late 1990s. So please don't think of classic as being old, but this is a wonderful film, Bride of Frankenstein, 1935. It's the sequel to Frankenstein. I think it's even better than the original. They had a bigger budget, all the same actors, Boris Karloff, same director, James Whale, and it is a wonderful film, and I have linked to a number of scenes in that film right there for you on YouTube. We're going to see some wonderful lighting. We're going to see the creation of the bride. There's also a great scene with a blind man, the wonderful trope of the blind man doesn't know that this is a monster and doesn't know that he should be afraid of the monster. There's also a scene in the film that I didn't link to, but it's a small child, and she doesn't know that she should be afraid of the monster. And I just... maybe you don't know, maybe I'm reminding you, but that is not Frankenstein. That is the monster. Frankenstein is a doctor, Dr. Frankenstein. And he created the monster, and that's what he is named in the credits, the monster. And I know today we often talk about, oh no, here comes Frankenstein, he's going to attack. But technically, that is the monster created by Dr. Frankenstein. From the book Mary Shelley way back in 1818, and like I said, this film, it has so many classic tropes. The scientist playing God, creating life in a lab. We have the misunderstood monster. We have castles, thunder and lightning and storms, and all of that. And so all of that put together makes this such a classic film. So check out some of the links that I have provided for you. Okay, and then after you do that, we'll go to the second stage, and that is revisionist. And I like to talk about this somewhere around this point because there are lots of revisionist films in the 1970s in particular, and even going forward from there, and the 1980s and so on. So a lot of revisionist, a lot of the classic stuff, some of the classic westerns were done. The Searchers, 1950s, John Ford, classic musicals, Singing in the Rain. How are you going to improve on that? How can you possibly make a better musical or a better western or a better horror film than Bride of Frankenstein? And so a lot of the 1970s directors, they've been to film school, they've seen all these classic movies, and they decide for that era, 60s and 70s, that they're going to revise. They're going to take a sideways look at classic genre movies. And that's exactly what Stanley Kubrick does in The Shining, based on the Stephen King novel from a few years before that, and then wonderful Jack Nicholson. And again, they are revising, so we don't have dark, stormy weather and castles and all that. We have this big, beautiful hotel high up in the Rocky Mountains. It's very brightly lit for many of the scenes. It is not old and decrepit, and there's no thunder or rain or lightning or anything like that. And the monster really is an alcoholic. He's an alcoholic. Now, there's some supernatural stuff in there, possibly reincarnation. Little young Danny has some interesting powers and things like that. But for the most part, when he turns into a monster, it's because he's been drinking. Okay, so we're kind of revising the whole horror monster genre. Okay, and we're going to get a lot of that, not just The Shining from 1980, but we're going to get that with romance, with Harold and Maude. We're going to get it with war movies, with MASH. We're going to get lots of revisionism once we get into the 70s and 80s. And talking about neo, which means new, or revisionist films, and we've been talking about horror, and for Frankenstein films, mad scientists creating life in a lab, that which man shall not do, right? That should be God's own provenance, and so on and so forth, okay? And here now we have creating, well, Edward Scissorhands, we're not exactly sure what he is, but with Ex Machina and Blade Runner and Westworld, we are getting robots, if you want to call them robots, or cyborgs, or replicants, or androids, but it's kind of a twist on creating life in a lab, right? Instead of Dr. Frankenstein with getting dead body parts, which is basic grave robbers and body parts and sewing them together and all that, today we are just as likely to be making some sort of a robot, cyborg, android thing, okay, replicant in the case of Blade Runner. And this is Blade Runner here to the right. That is Rachel, and she is a replicant, right? She was created in a lab. And sci-fi loves this kind of stuff. They really do, because then they can comment on the present day, and on other things too, on philosophy. There we have it, right? Do they have a soul? Should you be tried for murder for putting out a robot or a cyborg, right? Are you a murderer? Do they have a soul? Are they slaves? Okay, so that allows scientists, not scientists, it allows writers and directors to comment on all sorts of stuff, right? Depending on what is going on in society at the time. And so it's one of the fun things, this whole thing about creating life and using them as slave labor and things like that. And that stuff runs all through, oh boy, does it ever run through Blade Runner and Westworld. Westworld's not a movie. Well, it was a movie, but I'm referring to the HBO series. But that stuff, it runs all through all that, creating slave labor and all of that. Okay, so back to our 3 stages. And our third stage is fun. It is the parody. Okay, we've revised it. We've established what goes on, right, with the castles and whatever. Or, again, it could be a Western, or it could be a musical or something like that, or detective, right? They're all genres. I just happen to pick horror because there are 3 films that I wanted to talk about with you. And so our third stage, the parody, and Mel Brooks is the master of the parody. He is the director of wonderful parodies on Westerns, Blazing Saddles, on the horror movie with Young Frankenstein, and High Anxiety is a parody of Alfred Hitchcock movies, Vertigo in particular, right? Vertigo, Fear of Heights, where you might have high and anxiety. I love that. Spaceballs, which is a takeoff on Star Wars movies, and Robin Hood, Men in Tights. So a lot of wonderful stuff from Mel Brooks. That's Gene Wilder right there as Young Frankenstein, and Mel made it in black and white. There's a lot of resistance from studios making movies in black and white. It's sometimes some feel that it's really hard to draw an audience in with black and white. People don't want to see black and white movies. Young Frankenstein was a big hit. I don't know, maybe it would have been a bigger hit in color. I don't know, but it's wonderful in black and white. It works really nicely in black and white. And I chose the scene with the blind man in Bride of Frankenstein because Mel Brooks is going to do a parody of that blind man scene in Young Frankenstein, and I wanted you to see those two for comparison's sake. And it's a ton of fun. Yeah, It's Alive, The Bride, all that wonderful stuff. Okay, so that's going to kind of thread its way through the class, right? In coming classes, we will be talking about revisionist films from such and such a director, and so on. So we'll keep this all in mind. This is gonna come back. This is gonna echo back through the semester. All right, we're gonna change topics. Late 50s and through the 60s, we have a rather bloated era. The studios are still suffering from the impact of television. We have the widescreen movies. We've talked about that, I think, a little bit. They're trying to make movies completely different from television. Television is small. For a lot of people, it's still black and white. Television sets are maybe 21 inches in diagonally, maybe 27. That would be a good-sized TV. And movies are going to have big, widescreen, color movies, very long, 3 or 4 hours long, spectacle, right? So they're going to try to throw spectacle at us. Sometimes you can do it, and sometimes not. And there are a few really good, big spectacle movies. Lawrence of Arabia would be one of them, that's for sure, from director David Lean, Bridge on the River Kwai, and Dr. Zhivago, 3 David Lean movies. So there are some really good, big, giant movies, but too many of them are bloated, they're too long, and they just are plain not good. And the studios are making fewer movies and spending more money on them, right? So they don't have as much product to put out. And they're putting out too many of these big, giant, bloated movies, and there are a lot of them. I just picked Cleopatra because it's rather famous for being a big, bloated flop. $300 million in today's dollars, that's an awful lot of money. There are movies that cost $300 million today, a few, not too many, but boy, you got to make your money back. And the longer it takes the studio to make its money back, the longer it takes them to pay off the loan from the bank that they had to borrow from. So if it's going to take them a year or 2 or 3 or 4 years to pay off that loan, then they're paying lots and lots of interest. Okay, that's part of the business of all this. Studios borrow money, make a movie, and they want to get the money back as fast as they can to pay off the loan. Okay, you don't want a 10 or 20 year loan, right? You only want to borrow that money for a couple of years. And so Cleopatra, it might have eventually broken even, but it took way too long to pay all that money off. And they ended up, because of Cleopatra, having to sell off some of their lot. And the movie was made at 20th Century Fox, and they sold off hundreds of acres, and those hundreds of acres became a city, Century City, right, named after 20th Century Fox. So if you go up to the west side of LA, just south of Beverly Hills, there is Century City. They didn't sell off the whole back lot, but enough of it that there is Century City and some big hotels and a shopping mall and things like that. And that is Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, and they were a thing during the making of this movie. It was rather notorious. They were married to different people when they went to make the movie, and they had a very hot and torrid on-screen and off-screen love affair. And of course, all of the tabloids got wind of it. They didn't do a very good job of hiding it, really. They didn't pay off hotel staff to keep their mouths shut. They were seen in restaurants in Rome where they made the movie, necking in the back corner and things like that. And so it was rather notorious there for them and the film. Some people say any publicity is good publicity, but still things were a little bit more prudish back in 1961, 1962 when the movie was made. The whole idea of adultery and divorce and so on was really unpalatable. It's very unpopular. A lot of people swore they'd never see the movie and so on because of that. Other people say that, you have to believe that they're in love. And that's partly, this is a little bit of a side point, but that's partly why a lot of male actors don't want to come out of the closet and admit to their homosexuality. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but there is a fear, especially at the studio, that nobody will buy that he could possibly be in love with that woman. Now, everybody's an actor or an actress. They're doing it on screen, right? Richard Burton is not Italian. He's not Roman, but that's okay, right? He's playing Mark Antony. But if he were an out-of-the-closet homosexual, people would say, oh, that's a laugh. That's a laugh. He couldn't possibly be, right? So that's part of the problem. That's part of the problem with some actors and actresses, too, that there's a fear that the audience won't buy it, right? That they won't buy it, even though it's all a fictitious story up there on the screen and the whole rest of it. So anyway, the whole idea of actors getting it on off screen really makes it even more truthful. Oh, look, there's Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and psst, hey, did you hear that Burton and Taylor and all that? So people, maybe that helps. Who knows? Maybe that helps. But the $300 million budget didn't help a whole lot, and the fact that the movie is 4 hours long didn't help a whole lot either. So that movie and the trailer that I linked to points out that it is a roadshow picture, and it's going to say "Reserve your seats now." Okay, in the trailer, and a roadshow movie was a special engagement movie. Sometimes there would be special lobby displays. Sometimes even the ushers or usherettes, as they were known, would dress up in costumes and things like that. There would be reserved seating, and importantly, intermissions. And I think intermissions are a great idea. We have a number of movies that are 3 hours long. All the Lord of the Rings movies and Hobbit movies and so on are 3 hours long, and that's a pretty long time for one bladder to go. And so we are kind of forced to miss those few minutes while we dart out of the theater. And back in the 40s, and especially in the 50s and 60s, movies would have intermissions, right? They could take a 15-minute break, sell lots more popcorn, things like that. Maybe that's why watching at home, streaming is so popular, because you can pause and grab a bite to eat, or go to the bathroom or something like that. So roadshow movies, they were special in that way. Some theaters with the reclining seats are getting back to the reserved seating idea, which I think is kind of nice. Instead of getting in line and waiting and rushing to find your seat, you go online and reserve your seat, and it's a nice reclining seat and all that. But sadly, intermissions haven't come back, so too bad about that. Most of these roadshow movies are also a limited release, and that means that they play first off in big cities, New York and LA, and slowly over a period of weeks, if not months, more and more cities, other big cities, Chicago, whatever, Dallas, Detroit, Cleveland, and then smaller and smaller cities. And sadly, I grew up in a small farm town in Michigan, and sometimes it would be months before those movies would come to Little Caro, Michigan, and I was a movie fan, and it seemed like I was waiting forever for some of these movies. And that is a limited release, also known as a platform release. Today, it is still popular, but not with big roadshow movies or anything like that, but with smaller Academy Award type movies, Parasite, movies like that are going to have a hard time finding their audience. Word of mouth has to get out, and hopefully critics, and even more importantly, awards, possibly Oscar nominations, Golden Globe nominations, critic group nominations, and things like that. And so a small film that is a serious film that might be out there for winning an Oscar has to be really nurtured. Has to be really nurtured by the studio, and so they will do a limited release for those kinds of movies, not those big bloated movies of the Cleopatra era. So limited release still with us, reserved seating coming back, but not intermissions, not yet. The live TV generation, these are a number of directors who have made some wonderful movies in the 60s and 70s, and they started off in the 1950s in television. And not all of it, but a lot of television in the 1950s was live. And they were anthology shows, so they didn't have continuing characters, but they were sort of like a 90-minute play, right? A little 90-minute play, just like you might see, in a small theater or something like that on Broadway. And 3 or 4 cameras and live, so they would put it out, right there in New York, right at 9 o'clock, and they would go live, and out it would go. And as it went across the country, they would film it off a TV monitor. That's called a kinescope. They'd film it off a TV monitor, and then out on the West Coast, here in Southern California, they would show the film of the video. Yeah, that's what it was. It was a film of the video. It's called the kinescope, and they would show it 3 hours later. But for the most part, it was live. Okay, so it's kind of a bit of daring do. Actors could forget their lines. Props might not work if a gun's supposed to go, pop or something like that, and it doesn't. Then, so it's kind of nerve-wracking going out live out over the whole country. Now, that's important, but professionals can do that sort of thing, because think about it, they do that basically on Broadway stages every single night, and any stage, not even Broadway, just anywhere. Actors remember the lines. Sometimes they forget. They just keep on going. They don't stop. They don't yell cut, and they keep on going. And sometimes props don't work and things like that. That's theater, right? And television, I think people expect it to be like movies, like perfect, right? If you don't get it on the first take, you yell cut and you start over again. But TV in the 1950s was a little bit more like theater, and it was kind of exciting because you didn't know if something was going to go wrong. And that's partly the whole thing with Saturday Night Live. It's comedy, so that's removed, right? The whole seriousness of all of that. Having a problem, they can laugh if something doesn't work or something like that. But these directors did wonderful work in the 1950s, and a lot of the little teleplays that they did in the 1950s were turned into feature-length film. Movies like Marty, or television plays turned into movies like Marty and 12 Angry Men and Days of Wine and Roses. They were all turned into feature films. That's how good television was, that they would start on television with these live TV directors, and people would say that is so good that we need to make a movie out of it. Okay, and then they could spend a little bit more time on the lighting and maybe get movie star type people to play some of the parts that the TV people were doing. Not all of the people on TV got cast into the feature films. That happens on Broadway shows too. Very famously, Julie Andrews did not get cast in My Fair Lady, even though she had done it on Broadway for, a year or two. And she went on to make Mary Poppins, and she won the Oscar for Mary Poppins, so people called Mary Poppins Julie's Revenge. Okay, anyway, that was kind of a side point. Wonderful directors, John Frankenheimer, Arthur Penn. We're going to see some of his work with Bonnie and Clyde. And Sidney Lumet, we're going to see some of his work with Network in this class. So I want to mention these guys because they're kind of obscured by the much more famous film school generation. The film school generation, not as famous as the film school generation. They're going to get obscured by them. That is George Lucas. That is Francis Coppola and Steven Spielberg and Martin Scorsese, and they're kind of the one that got kind of famous. Books were written about them, and so on. Easy Riders and Raging Bulls, How the Rock and Roll Generation Saved Hollywood, books like that. But this live TV generation, they're pretty good too, and the film school generation, they stood on their shoulders, basically. That's how that goes. So they were making these wonderful little, not bloated, right, but they were making these little movies for television, little gritty type movies for television. And so a lot of television work was better than the big bloated film work, right? It was lean and mean and went fast and very intelligent and so on. So some really good stuff coming out of television and morphing into movies. And I usually have a DVD that I show. It's about 5 or 6 minutes of the live TV generation, and I'm trying to find something on YouTube, and I have yet to be able to find anything on YouTube to talk about the live TV generation of directors. There's plenty of live TV stuff on YouTube, but it doesn't talk about the live TV generation of directors. So I'm going to keep looking, but it's not the DVD that I would be able to show in class, and darn it. Okay, anyway, we are going to move on. It's wonderful stuff, though. We are going to move on to a little bit of foreign films. I've got 3 quick looks at some rather influential foreign films that the film school generation in particular are going to glom onto. Italian movies have this neo-realism. English does what they call kitchen sink cinema. So instead of showing palaces and things like that, they're just showing ordinary homes and so on with kitchen sinks and that sort of thing. But the famous one, and that's the picture that we're seeing here, is the French New Wave. So all over the world, they were sort of trying to make movies after World War II. Most of the world's film industry was, they stopped making movies for those years. Things were all bombed out. They're trying to rebuild society and everything, especially in Europe and Japan. And so they can't make big, giant, bloated movies like Cleopatra. Their industry doesn't have that kind of budget even. And so the French, in particular, they start making these really interesting, lean movies, breaking lots of rules. That was kind of a big thing. They broke lots of classic Hollywood cinema rules, and here they are walking down the street. They don't have shooting permits or anything like that. There's just one camera operator hiding the camera in a box or in a bag or something like that, walking backwards. You can tell that the camera's about waist high. Okay, he's got the camera sort of down by his waist. He's backing up. And I have linked to the entire film, which is kind of interesting. Now, I certainly don't expect you to watch the entire film. I would show about 10 or 11 minutes of the film, especially when they're outside walking down the street. And I've listed the time 9 minutes to 12 minutes and 19 minutes to 25 minutes. So that's the stuff that I would be showing in class. And it's kind of fun to watch them break so many of these rules. Like I say, they don't have shooting permits. And I love to watch the people because the streets aren't always empty like that. And sometimes they get crowds of people and they can tell something's going on. You see people looking around. He's a nice looking guy. She's a pretty young lady. And there's a guy backing up in front of them. But they're Parisians. They're big city people, right? They're not impressed by cameras and movies and stuff like that. Maybe they don't even know a movie's being made. But it's fun. I love to watch the people that aren't technically in the movie sort of turning their heads and looking. One guy goes up to borrow a match from this guy, and he stays in character. Nobody else could. He stays in character and says, "I don't have any matches. Go away." That's pretty fun. This is Jean Seberg. She had quite a controversial career, and Kirsten Stewart played her in a recent film. So you might check that out. I think it's just called Seberg. And this is 1959 in Paris. It finally came to America in 1960. She's got very short hair, kind of a European sort of a style. She's wearing slacks. A lot of American girls would still be wearing dresses and things like that. If you think to the movies like like Hairspray or something like that, or Grease or something. Women weren't wearing slacks and short hair and all that. It was more of a Marilyn Monroe era back then. And she's American, so when she speaks French, she has kind of an American accent. But a lot of rules were broken. They don't have dolly tracks, just some guy carrying a camera, possibly put somebody in a wheelchair or something like that. They don't get shooting permits. When people come, they just run off. They don't have cranes. They find a high window and shoot from that. lights, it's all available light. If they're indoors, then they try to shoot near windows and things like that. They have a script. Okay, they do have a script. But they also just cut right in the middle of a shot, right? There's a shot, and normally in Hollywood, you would try to cover that up, okay? So if somebody starts their line and then they forget what they're going to say and then they continue, you would cut out that 5 or 10 seconds, splice the two good parts together, and then cut to what they would call a reaction shot of somebody listening, right? You listen, you cut the 10 seconds out of the middle of the shot. That's going to jump because there is missing time. That's what a jump cut is. There's missing time. And you cover it up. You cut to a wide shot or another angle or a reaction shot or something like that. No, not the French. They're not going to do that. They just leave all the jumps in. Jump, 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 jump. They don't care, right? So it's fun breaking the rules like that. It really is. And right after where they're driving around in the car, that's where a lot of the jump cuts are. And then she goes into a restaurant to talk to somebody, and there's a whole bunch of jumps in this guy's conversation. It's really kind of fun. So you might check that out right after they drive around in the convertible, driving through Paris. Jumps and all that stuff. And walking right down the street, no shooting permits. A lot of fun. And these young film students, they would see these movies, right? When they got to film school, when they got to NYU or USC, their film classes would show these movies, these new movies that were only 5 or 6 or 7 years old at that time, and they would be inspired. I want to make movies like that, raw and gritty and real, right? That's what these young 1960s film students would be thinking to themselves. They've talked about that. Yes, I want to make movies like they're making in Europe, right? Black and white and jump cuts and all that stuff. So very influential. Not a lot of people saw it, but film students saw it, right? The right people saw it. And that's how a movie can be influential, if the right people see it. Okay, now we're going to go on to Blow-up from 1966. This is Michelangelo Antonioni. It's in English, and he is Italian. So it's kind of foreign and kind of not. Really, but it's a lot of fun, and it really feels like the 60s. He's a fashion photographer, and he has ambitions to be more of an artist. So in his spare time, he shoots black and white photos of factory workers and things like that. And in the middle of his shooting, he accidentally shoots a murder in a park, and maybe there's a gun way off in the distance, and maybe there's a body, so he takes the negative, puts it under the enlarger, and keeps enlarging it, enlarging it, enlarging it, or blowing it up and blowing it up and blowing it up, trying to see the detail. And of course, the more he enlarges the frame, the blurrier it gets. Very interesting movie. I just love it, and it was a good size hit. And pushing the boundaries, there's casual nudity, right? It's not really sex, but there's casual nudity, things like that. They're models, they're getting dressed and so on, and young girls, sort of like groupies and so on. And this is before the rise of the rating system. It's before R-rated movies and all that. And movies like this, movies like Blow-up, movies like the Fellini movie that we've got coming up next, were really pushing the envelope. Okay, they were really pushing the envelope for the theaters and for ratings and all that. This was not part of the traditional Hollywood production code. We talked about the Hollywood production code. We talked about it also being called the Hays Code. But theater owners, they weren't owned by studios, right? There was no more vertical integration. So if they thought that they could maybe make some money in a city like New York or in a college town, then they would run those movies. And unless the cops came in and arrested them or something like that, they could make money, right? So it was a little bit of a business gamble to show these movies. Like I say, mostly in cities or college towns and so on. So Blow-up and Breathless and so on would be shown around America, and directors are saying, I want to make mature movies like that, like these Europeans. They're making movies for adult adults. They're not adult movies. It's not porn, but they're making movies with an adult sensibility. And they want to, these young film students and directors, some of the live TV guys too, they want to make movies like the Europeans are doing, right? More real, more truthful, not this big, giant gladiators and pyramids and kings and queens stuff that American studios are doing so much. We also have Federico Fellini. He's an Italian director, definitely an auteur, and 2 foreign language Oscars. They don't call it foreign language anymore. I'm trying to remember what they call it. International, maybe, something like that. I can't remember. Parasite won that, and then it won the regular Oscar for Best Feature last year. Anyway, this is La Dolce Vita, The Sweet Life in Italian, right? The Sweet Life. And that made Fellini rather famous and notorious even. And this very sexy, curvy movie star, Anita Ekberg, and playing a movie star, and Fellini's sort of alter ego, played by Marcello Mastroianni, playing a reporter and going through the streets of Rome with sort of decadent society. Some people with money, maybe barons or baronesses or something like that. And Fellini's shooting it all, right? Sort of fly on the wall. And he does another film called 8½, also with Marcello Mastroianni. There he is. And this is a movie about making a movie. The movie that they're making is the movie we're watching. Yes, it's very inside-y. Okay, and I've linked to a couple of scenes from it. Fellini had made a number of feature films before this and a number of short films. They used to do anthology movies where a director would make maybe a 30-minute or 25, 30, or 35-minute movie, and they would be strung together. And so Fellini had made, at this point, 7½ movies. So this is his 8½ film. Yeah, it's just how many films he's made. Number 8½. And it is about a director. Now, Fellini is not quite that handsome. Full head of hair, all that. He's a little bit pudgy, a little bit balding, but this guy's playing Fellini, which is kind of fun. And I always say, obviously, if somebody's going to make the Dave Eccles a movie, it would have to be somebody like, I don't know, Johnny Depp or somebody, or Chris Evans or somebody to play Dave Eccles, because, yeah, that's how I see myself. But anyway, it's kind of fun. Fellini casting Marcello Mastroianni as Guido, the director. And he's trying to think about his next movie. That he spends the whole movie trying to think what his next movie is going to be about. And he has daydreams, things like that, which television started adopting a few years later, these little daydreams and things like that. And sometimes we'll see a flashback scene of Marcello, Guido, or Fellini's life as a kid, young boy growing up. And then after that scene is over, a actor in the movie who's playing a writer is going to say, what's it all about? Your imaginings of this young whatever childhood as, all right? So they're sort of going to be talking about the movie as we're watching it. Yeah, they're going to talk about the movie as we're watching it. It's a very interesting movie, kind of out there, a little bit like something Charlie Kaufman might come up with. Not for everybody, but again, these young film students are watching these movies and they're really thinking, wow, that is daring stuff. I got to try that. Okay, and our third foreign director that every film student knows, and certainly those film students in the 1960s knew, is Akira Kurosawa. And why don't I have his name on there? Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's Akira Kurosawa. Is he here? Well, I'm going to have to fix that. But in the meantime, that is Akira, A-K-I-R-A. You need to get this down. Sorry, I don't have his name up there. I have the star of the movie, but not his name. Kurosawa, K-U-R-A-S-A-W-A, Akira Kurosawa, and his wonderful film, Seven Samurai from 1954, and very highly influential plot. A a team of mercenaries, basically, together to save a village, and it's basically the same plot as the Western, The Magnificent Seven, and the remake, The Magnificent Seven, and there's also a bunch of movies in the 60s, The Magnificent Seven Return, things like that. The Three Amigos, the wonderful comedy, was basically these three actors who are supposed to be heroic movie stars, and they're going to maybe save a village. Bug's Life has that same story, Battle Beyond the Stars, 13th Warrior. It's a wonderful story, a wonderful plot. And Kurosawa is going to make this wonderful movie with the samurai, and it is a very human and very humane movie. It's not all action. We're going to really meet all of these samurai and the villagers who don't really trust them very much. They are Ronin. They don't have a master, so they're sort of off on their own, and they are hungry, and they need to make some money, and they have skills, certain skills with swords and bows and arrows and horses and things like that. And they are going to get gathered together, and they are going to try to save the village from the bandits, or brigands, as they're called in the movie. I love that, brigands. And there are going to be a series of attacks and some wonderful action sequences. Oh my goodness, the action sequences are just wonderful. And let's, yeah, there we go. Influenced Dirty Dozen, Mission Impossible, A-Team, Avengers, Justice League, all that wonderful, wonderful stuff. The way Kurosawa stages action is so modern. When we see movies, and sometimes I'll show, not in our class, but in another class, I'll show some scenes from a James Bond film, Goldfinger, from 1964. And it's great. Sean Connery's great, and the sets and all that stuff are great, but the action, it's not the way we think of action today. It's not cut real fast. They don't have great stuntmen. It looks a little clunky to our eyes. We are much better at doing action these days than they were back then. Now, nothing against older movies. The acting, the plots, all that was fantastic. Casablanca, Seven Samurai, all that stuff, fantastic stuff. But the way they used to do action, like I say, some of the old westerns, some of the James Bond movies, not quite as good. But not this film. Seven Samurai, it looks so modern, it is cut so nicely, it is shot, long lenses, they shoot this epic battle in the rain. The way Kurosawa is placing his camera, sometimes he'll place the camera on the ground and then a body will fall into the shot, right? So you will see a brigand on a horse. We'll see one of the samurai pull back the arrow in his bow. The camera will cut to the ground, and we will see the body fall into the frame. Oh, it's wonderful stuff. It's really wonderful stuff. So anyway, Kurosawa, a couple of films. This one, Seven Samurai, and also, well, there's Yojimbo. There's all sorts of stuff like that. Rashomon, another wonderful film from Kurosawa. So these directors here, and I'm sorry I don't have Kurosawa up there, and it's too late for me to change it. I'm not going to. But anyway, write it down. Akira Kurosawa, and a big influence on these young film school directors. Okay, next, change of topic. We have social influences. So we have filmic influences, right? We just saw some filmic influences on these young directors, and now we have social influences on 1960s and early 1970s films, and of course filmmakers. And I would say chief up there pretty high, maybe not only, but chief up there would be the Vietnam War, and there was a draft, and the draft is going to affect young men who turn 18, and they're going to have to register for the draft. And so that means that college campuses are going to be roiling with activity, right? You know, ban or stop the war and all that kind of stuff. It's gonna have a big thing on campus because there aren't enough enlistees to man the army, the military. They want 500,000 people there in Vietnam at the height, 530,000, and there aren't enough people volunteering. So with the draft, it is a lottery, so all of the dates of the year are going to go on ping pong balls in a drum, and all of the numbers 1 through 365 are going to go into a different drum, and one drum is going to get spun round and round, and somebody's going to reach in and pick out August 28, and then another drum is going to go round and round, and somebody's going to go in and pick out number 37. So if your birthday was on August 28th, like mine is, then your draft number is 37. So what does that mean? Well, if your draft number was under 100, there was a pretty good chance that you might get called up. After 100 or maybe 110 or 120, they had enough young men, for the war. Right? They needed to keep, people are there for, however many months or a year, and then they're sent home, rotated out. So there's a constant churning of people going to and leaving Vietnam. And so if they drafted young men with draft numbers under 100 or thereabouts, then there's a chance that they might have to go off to Vietnam. So what does that mean? Well, there were, you could volunteer, you could go if you wanted to go, that was fine. I didn't particularly want to go, and so I became a student, and you could have a deferment. It was 2S, and you could be deferred. I think maybe that's the 2S, I can't see it. You could go, and or you would not go. You would have a deferment. You had to be a full-time student, so you had to take a full load, pass all your classes. So some students in danger of flunking a class would talk to their college professors. Please, professor, please give me a passing grade. I don't want to go to Vietnam. And depending on the professor, that might happen. Okay, so you couldn't just take a part-time and string it out or anything like that. You had to be full-time, and it was only good till you got your degree. So there were those 4 years, and then you would lose your deferment. And then anybody with a draft number of like 200 or 250, right? There's 365 days in a year. Then who cares, right? They were kind of fine. They were all done. But this anti-war movement was a big thing in the country as a whole, but especially among young people whose very lives might depend on that. And that's where you might get stop the war, peace marches, and things like that. Okay, so social influences. Next up, dealing still young people, rock and roll music, youth culture, all of that. Woodstock from 1969. Rock music was a little divisive. A lot of it is meant to be played kind of loud, whether it's Steppenwolf or the Rolling Stones or Jimi Hendrix or Led Zeppelin or whatever. It's kind of loud, and it was kind of divisive. A lot of parents didn't like that loud rock stuff. Maybe they didn't mind the Beatles or Simon and Garfunkel, but they weren't real crazy about this loud rock music and all of that. And that is kind of running through the culture, right? Going through the culture. And a lot of it has to do with youth, really. Recreational drugs certainly made inroads among young people. Old people too, sure, grandmas and grandpas too, but especially on college campuses and things, marijuana to start with, and then other what they called mind-expanding drugs like LSD or peyote or mushrooms or something like that to expand your mind. Okay, not just to get stoned, but to expand your mind, right? It maybe a spiritual quest or something like that. So that would be coming out of the Southwest, maybe out of Mexico and out of the cities, and so on, where maybe the musicians might be, and so on. So recreational drugs, another social influence on movies. Okay, next, number 4, we have fashion. Yes, fashion, sure. We have long hair on young men, emulating their favorite rock stars, right? The Beatles and whatever, and Rolling Stones and all those guys with their nice long hair, and so on. And it becomes kind of a political statement. If you have long hair, then today I see my students, and some have long hair and some have shaved heads and everything in between on the young men, and who cares really? Who cares? But back then it was kind of a political statement that said, I'm against the war and I smoke pot and here's my middle finger for you, right? It was kind of a middle finger to society sort of a thing, with the long hair. It was kind of a statement. And I had a friend when I was in high school. I grew up in a small farm town in Michigan, and he was from a bigger town a little ways off, and they came to visit, and he had hair down to that's not him, but he had nice long hair. And we went into town. We went into my little farm town. We went into a drugstore or something like that, and a guy that knew me walked up behind me and whispered in my ear, "Who's your girlfriend?" Yeah, you look like a girl, right? They said, even though so many guys had beards and so on, you look like a girl. And I don't think I look like a girl, right? Do it? No. Okay. Anyway, yeah, that's me. My friends. We worked at record stores. This is in the 1970s. But it was, and it gets ridiculous. It really does about hair, but it's a thing. Parents are fighting with their kids. Go get a haircut. Get a haircut, hippie, and all that kind of thing, right? And it's so silly. And then of course you have, well, Jesus had long hair, right? Oh, shut up! Don't mention his name, right? So you get these awful arguments. They called it the generation gap. And even young women, right? Women were wearing shorter and shorter skirts, not the traditional knee-length skirts that young girls were expected to wear in school. Some young ladies were wearing pants, jeans, or slacks or something like that, right? And they could also be sent home. But it really hit young guys, especially in high school. Colleges were a little bit more open to this stuff by then. But small towns in the north and all over in the south, the whole idea of long hair and all of that was divisive, right? It really was. It was divisive. And again, a social influence. Something much more serious than that is civil rights and the voting rights movement. And this is a march. That's Martin Luther King there and some other famous civil rights activists marching. I don't know the nature of this march. It could be the March on Selma, but really just trying to register blacks to vote, believe it or not. And in the South, Alabama and Mississippi, there were very, very few, maybe a few dozen blacks that were allowed to register to vote. They were told that they had to pay a poll tax. They were told that they had to recite the Declaration of Independence. They were told all sorts of things, right? They weren't allowed to vote. And so there was a movement to register blacks to vote. Some young college students rode buses down to the South called Freedom Riders, yes, to help register blacks to vote. Some of them were killed. Yes, the college students were killed, sometimes by police or other people that were hell-bent on keeping blacks in their place and not allowed to vote in the South. And the civil rights movement had been gaining steam since the 1950s. It's still around in the 1960s, the March on Selma. 4 little schoolgirls in a bombed church. It got really violent. Police setting dogs on protesters, peaceful protesters, water cannons, all sorts of stuff. It was very ugly and very divisive, and it was shown on TV right next to the news from Vietnam, right, on the evening newscast. And that is going on. And young filmmakers, right, young filmmakers who are maybe in college or making movies and things, and or middle-aged filmmakers for that matter, not just young filmmakers, they are seeing this and they are being affected by it. And there are going to be some movies in the 60s, in the heat of the night, movies like that, that are going to reflect all this. Remember, movies are going to really reflect what's going on in society, right? There are classic movies like Casablanca, but it is still going to reflect what is going on in society. It's very important. Movies are really of their time. And kind of as an example, I have to throw out there vampire movies, because in the 1980s, vampire movies and blood-sucking vampires and the AIDS epidemic, and now blood has kind of a different connotation, right? And so some vampire movies of the 1980s are actually commenting on AIDS. Okay, so there are different ways. Allegory, there are different ways that movies can comment on all this. Even Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek talked about civil rights. Now, he did it in a sci-fi way, in an allegorical way with aliens and whatnot, but he was commenting on civil rights, and so was Rod Serling with Twilight Zone. Okay, they all found ways to talk about this stuff that was going on in society. So Twilight Zone and Star Trek, in their original incarnations, were very much of the 1960s. Also in the 1960s, we have women's equality movement, the Equal Rights Amendment, guaranteeing women equal pay for equal work. And it really was a different world back then. If you told somebody you were going to see your doctor, they would say, "What's his name?" It would be unthinkable that it would be a woman. It would just be, "What? Really? I didn't, that's impossible. Might as well be a child, right? A woman doctor? A woman lawyer? What will they think of next?" I mean, that's the way people thought. A lot of people, not everybody, of course. That's the way some people thought. That, woman's place is in the home. They should be starting families. Some people thought that college was wasted on young women because they were just going to find a husband and drop out of the workplace and raise their family. And a college education would be wasted on a young woman. Yes, that's true. That's the way some people were thinking back then. And the joke was that young girls were working not on their BA degree or their MA degree, but on their MRS degree, right? Mrs., right? And so, yeah, very backward thinking among some segments of society. And the whole idea that they wanted equal pay and so on was very troubling to a lot of people, along with all this other stuff, long hair and the loud music and the drugs and all that stuff. It was very troubling to think about for segments of society. And at the very top of the political structure was the Watergate break-in and cover-up. And Watergate was an office complex in Northern Virginia, just an office complex. And in that complex, there was an office for the Democratic National Committee, and they were trying to elect a Democratic president, George McGovern, and some people trying to re-elect President Nixon snuck in. They planted bugs in the office and took photos of files and things like that, and they were trying to get the edge on the Democrats for the election. And it was really such a stupid thing to do because Nixon was running for re-election. I don't know that Nixon was ever really liked. That's not the kind of person he was. He wasn't liked like Reagan or anybody like that. But he was, he was trusted, former vice president and all that, kind of winding the war down. He was taking forever to wind the war down, but kind of winding the war down. And jobs and all that were okay. He was running for re-election, and he won by a landslide. But over the course of the year, the first 6, 7, 8 months that Nixon was in office, some intrepid reporters from the Washington Post, among other places, were following these men that broke in to the Watergate. Were caught. They were caught by the night watchman, and they were taken to the courts and bailed out. And it turned out that some of them were former CIA employees or FBI employees, and who bailed them out and where did the money come from. And as the money was traced and tracked and so on, over the course of all those many months, it turns out that it was coming from the White House. It was coming from the Oval Office, the president's office in the White House. And Nixon's chief law enforcement officer, the Attorney General, John Mitchell, was caught in the web of lies. His staff people, all that, they were caught, and finally there were it was found out. It's the stupidest thing. They found out there was an automatic taping system hidden in the White House, right? The conversations were recorded on audio tape. And they got those tapes, and they could hear Nixon saying, we could do it, and it would be wrong, all this and that and the other. So, well, it's just ridiculous, really. He didn't need any help. He was going to get reelected, but he the House impeached him, and after the impeachment, that means that the Senate is going to have a trial, and Nixon was assured that he had lost the votes from his party members, fellow Republican senators, that he would not win the vote. So before he could get voted out, he resigned. But basically, and technically he wasn't impeached, but it sure looked like he was going to, and he resigned in his 5th year in office. And his first vice president, Spiro Agnew, was caught for corruption and had to leave office, and so Nixon's second vice president, Gerald Ford, became president. So that's all going on in society. It's all on TV. It's all on the news. Day after day, people are seeing the war in Vietnam. People are seeing Martin Luther King marching for rights, all the rock music and all that, and the drugs and youth and the college campuses and culture and all that stuff. Oh my gosh, all that stuff is going on all through the country, and young filmmakers and middle-aged and older filmmakers, they are seeing all this, and that is going to influence the kinds of movies and, as I said, television shows, Star Trek, things like that. Culture is really a reflection of the times. All culture is really reflected. And so the 60s had a lot, and early 70s had a lot to do with the kinds of movies that are going to be made. Even movies like Bonnie and Clyde, set in the 1930s, are going to reflect on the 1960s. So that's exciting. We're going to come up in our next class. I won't say next week because you're self-pacing, but in our next class, we have Bonnie and Clyde. We're going to dive right in. We've spent 2 classes now sort of setting everything up, right? The first half of American cinema up to the 1960s, and then the stages of genre films and some influences, some influential filmmakers from around the world, Fellini and Kurosawa and people like that. And now we are ready to dive in. So in our next class, we're going to dive in deep into Bonnie and Clyde and Easy Rider and The Graduate and some other great movies. Okay, so till then, thank you for joining me, and see you next time.